And this can all lead to carbohydrate cravings. That tends to be the primary thing that happens when we have a kid that has compromised gut flora and we introduce refined foods, sugary foods, processed grains as some of their first foods. That just continues to feed these microbes that want to eat sugar. And so that propels a lot of this pickiness towards carbohydrates.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 131, and my guest is Jennifer Scribner. Jennifer is a nutritional therapy practitioner, a certified GAPS practitioner, and a restorative wellness practitioner. She is the author of the book From Mac and Cheese to Veggies, Please, How to Get Your Kid to Eat New Foods and End Picky Eating Forever and Stay Sane in the Process. This is based on her work with hundreds of clients. And in our conversation today, she talks about how we can change the diet of the pickiest kids. Our conversation centers on what's happening inside their bodies physiologically that makes them crave carbs and eschew food that would actually be helpful to them, what steps we can take as their parents to help them change those eating patterns, and how to handle reactions and consequences of that shift. It's a great conversation. I know everybody's going to get something out of it, and you will learn why it is critical for our children's health to make an effort to help them change their picky ways. Before we get into the discussion, we want to recognize our sponsors. This Wise Traditions podcast episode is brought to you in part by Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant, the probiotic everyone's talking about. Go to thriveprobiotic.com. And Green Pasture. Green Pasture products are inspired by the research of Dr. Weston A. Price. Traditional diets were much more rich in vitamins and nutrients than they are in our diets today. This is why they offer fermented cod liver oil, concentrated butter oil, and coconut oil in a variety of products and blends. Boost your health with wholesome, healthy Green Pasture products today. Go to greenpasture.org. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Jennifer.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here because the Weston Price Foundation has had a huge impact on my health and my career.
Oh, fantastic. I'm so glad to hear it. We are excited about this conversation as well because there are so many parents who are pulling their hair out because their children are picky eaters or will only eat 5 things, all like pasta, bread, cookies, and they just don't know where to begin. Why don't you kick us off in the right direction by telling us the story of Leo, a 2-year-old who was much the same way?
I have mostly worked with kids on the autism spectrum or sensory processing disorder. So they've had really severe picky eating. And that's what my professional experience started with. And Leo was a kid who was on the autism spectrum. He was your type of kid who eats 5 foods. He did not like to eat meat. He was really a carb kid, like most picky eaters. His parents came to me because they wanted to implement the GAPS diet, and they just couldn't imagine it would be possible with him to eat these type of foods, and they didn't think it was something they could do on their own.
Right. The GAPS diet, that is Natasha Campbell McBride's gut and psychology syndrome diet that's very restrictive at first, but helps promote gut healing.
Correct. Yeah. So they were starting with the GAPS intro diet, and I'm also a GAPS diet practitioner. And so that's how we ended up together.
Okay, go on. So what happened next? You said the mom tried it first?
Mom started the GAPS diet first and knew she had some gut issues herself. So she worked through that. She went through her lull of her energy, her healing reactions, got a handle on the cooking before she decided to move forward with Leo. So it had been a couple months with mom. And then we chose a starting date when everybody was home and could be present with him where they didn't have work so that this could be their full-time focus. Of course, like most kids, he refused to eat any of the meat stock, any of the meat, anything at all. What's really common with kids that are this picky is that they will fast for a period of time, and we keep them hydrated. We have an understanding that they're not going to starve themselves to death. So we waited that out. Of course, it's stressful in the moment. And since his parents were following the eating plan that they wanted him to be on, they just sat down and ate their meals like normal at the table. And after a few days, he came over and grabbed a piece of meat off of his mom's plate and started eating that and wanted more. And so they weren't offering it to him. It became more interesting to him. And that's when he started eating. And having never been much of a meat eater before, that was what he craved the most. And so they began making all kinds of meatloafs and meatballs and sneaking in veggies because he wasn't so keen on those. Fast forward now, it's been 5 years. You would not know that he ever had an autism diagnosis, and he's a very healthy eater, following a much more savory diet and rarely ever has the carbs that were such a preference for him in the past.
Now, how old was Leo when his parents got started on this trajectory, when they were doing this attempt to change over his diet?
He was about 2.5 years old. He had a pre-diagnosis of autism.
You said, the parents were sitting down to eat like normal. I'm sure inside there was a lot of turmoil, don't you think? It's so hard to watch our kids go hungry. I can't even imagine how those parents feel in those in-between days from when you kind of put your flag in the sand, to when they finally succumb. That's hard, right?
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to set your goals and get your mindset right and to get your support and to have everyone be on the same page and in agreement in your household, because it will be really stressful if you do that type of method where you're like, this is all we're eating, that's it. Otherwise, you're drinking water. They had agreed to that. It was stressful. It's not unusual for parents to cry in their bedroom at night for a couple minutes about the stresses of the day, but that passes. And when you look back a few months down the road, it was such a short period of time and it was so worth it to see your child becoming healthier, more vibrant. In the case of Leo, to be learning new words, to show affection to his parents for the first time ever, because with his autism diagnosis, he wasn't doing those things before. He wasn't learning new words. He wasn't meeting the developmental milestones. That couple weeks that were so stressful ended up being such a blessing in the long run.
Talk to us about shaping the mindset. You said it's not uncommon for parents to feel stress and concern and even to shed some tears. How do we shape it so that we can stand firm ultimately with our kids' health in mind?
This is one of the key things for me where I start with people is to figure out what your goals are and to really understand what it is you're going for and be firm in that so that you can keep your eyes on that bigger picture when the day-to-day isn't that pleasant. And to also get other people in your household to buy into that, because there's an energetic thing that happens if one of the family members or grandma lives with you, something like that. If somebody isn't really on board, the kids will sense that. And if they think someone will take pity on them, sneak them something on the side, that creates a lot longer process and a lot more disharmony within the family. So it's really important to win everybody's support in advance. Also, sometimes you have to actually not speak to people who wouldn't be supportive for a period of time, at least. I think it's completely okay to keep your dietary changes private when you know that you're going to come up against some type of pushback from other people. There may be friends or family member who feel like it's torture to not give your kids cookies and candy, like that they're kids and they somehow deserve it and that who cares because it's childhood, this is part of it, it's fun. That can be really detrimental to your mindset. And if you're talking to those people when you're in the midst of your kid not eating for a couple of days or you're really struggling, they're the ones who will say, oh, just give it up. This isn't really important anyways. And you need to not have that kind of person in your ear.
Right, right. I want to back up for a minute and ask you, how do we get picky kids in the first place? What makes the kids sensitive to certain tastes and textures?
Of course, like most things with health, a lot of it starts in the gut. And it can start with a combination of poor gut flora that we may have inherited from mom, or because we went through C-section or weren't able to breastfeed, or children that were adopted. Then if we end up with a compromised immune system, the kids get rounds of antibiotics. That wipes out more good flora. Environmental toxicity is put in the mix because we all are just exposed to that today through various household products, vaccines, things like that. There is some genetic propensity, but it's not huge. But the epigenetic factors that come into play, like how these environmental factors are playing with our genes. And this can all lead to carbohydrate cravings. That tends to be the primary thing that happens when we have a kid that has compromised gut flora and we introduce refined foods, sugary foods, processed grains as some of their first foods. That just continues to feed these microbes that want to eat sugar. And so that propels a lot of this pickiness towards carbohydrates. But there can also be distorted sensory processing due to toxicity within the brain. There can be issues within the mouth where any of our mucous membranes and secretions are part of our detoxification system. And so when we're eating things like fruits and vegetables and nuts that have more of the phytonutrients that we hear about that are so great, those are detoxifying substances for the body. And if that is getting in the mouth and it's interacting with something within the saliva, for instance, that can feel really uncomfortable to certain kids. That can mean things taste differently than we expect them to, or even temperatures can be different.
What else could be at play here, Jennifer?
The other thing that can happen is if there's a lip tie or a tongue tie, so a structural issue within the mouth that can cause feeding difficulties. And all of these things end up exacerbating any type of nutritional deficiency, because once our kids are picky, nutrients is what runs our detox system. We need our fat soluble nutrients and we need all the other micronutrients to keep our normal detoxification processes running.
So let's say I noticed and I'm concerned about my child's diet and their behavior and maybe even a failure to thrive on their part. I see some issues that concern me. How should I approach doing this kind of diet overhaul thing? What should be the method I should take?
It depends on the kid and it depends on the parent. In my book, From Mac and Cheese to Veggies, Please, I lay out 3 different methods that I've used with families. So the first one is the ABA, or Applied Behavioral Analysis method, which is something that is commonly used with kids on the autism spectrum. So it might be something that's familiar to you already, in which case you can just incorporate new foods into that process. The second option is to back into it. And especially if you're dealing with teenagers or if you have a really busy work schedule and you can't stay on top of the food so much, choosing a couple of foods that you want to get in and just adding those into the diet and kind of backing into your ideal diet is a great method as well. What I've most commonly used in my practice is what I call the cold turkey method. And that's kind of like rip the Band-Aid off. These are the foods we're eating. That's it. We're not having anything else from this point on. It's the most intense, but it's also the quickest.
You answered my question. I was going to ask you, what do you do if the kid is older? I imagine there's some listeners right now who are like, oh, I need to do this with my 13-year-old. That would be tough, right?
With older kids, you've really got to get their buy-in. And I suggest that parents look at this as an experiment and have an open mind with their kids and see what you can negotiate. Also, getting them in touch with how food is making them feel. A lot of times with teenagers, they don't want to make these changes, but they do want to do things like get rid of acne. They do notice their moods and their social anxieties. And so when you can introduce foods to them that shift those things and help them feel more comfortable in other ways, that can go a long way towards their buy-in. And maybe they're not going to eat this way with all their friends, but you can do so much with breakfast and dinners for sure.
Yes. Did you know that Dr. Weston A. Price wanted to apply what he learned when he visited traditional people groups around the world? So when he came back to the U.S., to his home in Ohio, he gave some students at a school just one meal a day, one very nutrient-dense meal a day, to see how that would impact their health and their behavior. And do you know that meal? It was some kind of broth and soup and hearty meal with maybe some sourdough bread and butter. It really made a dramatic change on those kids' lives.
Yes, I do remember learning that in school. And I think that having the grass-fed butter and those fat-soluble nutrients makes such a difference. It's something so many of our kids are deficient in today.
So let's say you've convinced me, and actually I don't need a lot of convincing because I've seen this pattern among young people. It's very concerning. So let's say I'm like, okay, I want to do this. How can I get ready? How can I gear up to go the cold turkey method?
You've got to get that buy-in, like I talked about, from other people in the household. And you've got to choose what foods you're going to be focusing on. So is it the Weston Price? Are you doing something like the GAPS diet? Is there some other customization that you need to do for the health of your kid? Figuring out what that is, how to do the cooking. Be competent in your cooking before you start any of these things, because it's going to go smoother for you when you feel like you know what you're doing in the kitchen every night. And your kids aren't going to tolerate food that doesn't taste good like you might put up with it since you put the effort forth. So you want to clean out your cabinets. You want to learn how to do the cooking. You want to make a meal plan, and you want to decide what date is the start date and not look back. Going through those steps, getting the support you need so that when you do it once, you do it right the first time. It's much easier than giving up after a couple of days and trying to come back again. Your kids will know that they have won that round and they will put up twice the fight next time.
Ooh, and that doesn't sound good. Also, what I want to let parents know is there are support groups all around the U.S. of parents who are feeding their families GAPS-friendly diets, and also there are Weston A. Price Foundation chapters everywhere. So if you're like, oh my gosh, I am an island, nobody around me has done anything like this, I beg to disagree and suggest that you go on, I know they'll find them on Natasha's site. Natasha Campbell McBride has some sites, and also on the Weston A. Price Foundation website, they can find chapters near them where they will certainly find people who can guide them through some of these things, especially where they can find access to real traditional foods.
And that's been a real blessing for people that I've worked with on the GAPS diet and in the GAPS class that I teach, to be able to connect people locally with other people like them. Because even as adults following something like the Weston Price principles, we're often the black sheep of our friends that are still eating a standard diet, and that can be really isolating. And so being able to have other people to share these foods with and to have that sense of camaraderie and pleasure in a food that you feel good about eating is really, really important.
Coming up, Jennifer talks about what physical reactions we can expect from our children and how to handle these reactions as we help them make the dietary switch. We pause now to recognize our sponsors, Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant. Most probiotic pills just pass through our bodies without achieving the desired effect. Just Thrive is the first 100% spore-forming probiotic that arrives alive in the intestines naturally. It supports optimal gut health, digestive health, immune health, and delivers antioxidants. It is great for adults, kids, the whole family. The probiotic everyone's talking about. Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant. Visit their website at thriveprobiotic.com. And Green Pasture. Green Pasture sells a variety of products to boost your health. Organic virgin coconut oil, virgin coconut ghee, skincare balms, and more. Their fermented cod liver oil comes from the prolonged soaking of wild cod livers in brine, which allows cod livers to naturally ferment. It is a gentle process compared to that used by most highly industrialized cod liver oil manufacturers. Personally, I take their cod liver oil daily, and I rarely get sick. I am so thankful for Green Pasture's thoughtful, traditional practices and products. Go to greenpasture.org and place your order today. Now, I noticed in your book you have a chapter titled Anticipate Reactions. Does that mean, as you were saying, from the people around us or internally inside the family?
Anticipating reactions is about things that will come up, typically digestively, with your kids when you make a dramatic diet shift.
So I see you're not talking about like, ooh, I hate this, Mom. You're talking about how our body's going to react.
Correct. Yeah. So that can be things like constipation. That can be low blood sugar. That's a big one for our kids. Vomiting can be related to that. Understanding what might come up and then how to handle those things and navigate that so that you can proceed through it.
What is the most common reaction that kids go through when their diet changes like this?
For most kids, the most common reaction is low blood sugar, and that can show up as being nauseated and in some cases vomiting, intense hangriness, so hungry and angry. That can be sweating, that can be shaking, and that's actually a really dangerous state. And so we want to make sure that we are providing the body with enough glucose to manage that until the metabolism shifts over to fat burning. So when kids are eating mostly carbs, that's kind of like when you're building a fire and you're trying to keep it going with just kindling. You got to shovel something in all the time. So if we try to switch that over to more of a fat-based diet and metabolism, that takes some adjustment. And that's the time where we'll see those blood sugar issues. The most simple solutions for this is including a little bit of coconut oil or ghee mixed with a touch of honey and having that off of a spoon every hour or so just to make sure that the blood sugar is stable. We have honey for some quick energy, and we have ghee and coconut oil that don't require a lot of digestion to provide that longer lasting fat burning energy.
I have a friend who's also a nutritional therapy practitioner who recommends that same thing for people who want weight loss. Actually, just getting that fat during the day to help them sustain and curb their carb cravings.
And that's what we consider normal in our society now. Oh, you should eat every few hours because people are so carb addicted. And when we make this shift, you should, and even your kids will be able to go 4 or 5 hours without needing any kind of snack because they'll be satiated by the fat that's in their foods, really running their metabolism.
How can you tell if your child will need supplements? Is this new food, this new diet we're going to give them, going to be enough to sustain and meet their hormonal needs and their growth and everything?
When I talk about supplements, I generally mean digestive supplements. I'm not a big fan of putting in a lot of vitamins and multivitamins and things because I really want people to get their nourishment from food. But when we have a compromised digestive system, when we've been carb addicted for a long time, there might be low stomach acid, there might be poor fat digestion that needs to be addressed with supplements just to kind of kickstart these systems again. There can be enzymes needed. And so that's my view is how can we help the body make the most of the good food that we're eating?
I like that. I agree with that. I'm not a big fan of popping a lot of extra vitamins. We should be getting our vitamins and minerals from our food.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I want to pivot here and ask about our environment. Is there anything we need to do to make our home more diet friendly? Like you were saying, obviously clean the cabinets, but what else? What else can we do to help our child and shore up their health?
I am a huge proponent of a non-toxic home, and this is something I came to through my work with people on food in the first place. And you see that some issues aren't getting resolved in cases like asthma, eczema, little things that were just kind of ongoing issues that we really needed to look at. What are we putting on the body? What are we putting in the air in our homes? What are we cleaning with? All of these residues that are around can have such a profound effect because the skin absorbs what we put on it. We are inhaling the things that are in the environment. So if we're using cleaners, if we have a plug-in scent diffuser, all of that stuff is toxic, and we need to reduce that toxic burden of what the body needs to process out so that it can sort through just the things that we can't avoid coming in contact with.
So, Jennifer, what would you say to the skeptic who is like, oh my gosh, this woman is totally going overboard. I was picky when I was little about my food, and our family had scented candles everywhere, and I turned out fine. What would you say?
I was a lot like that until I was in my 30s. I felt that I was fine. I grew up on processed food. But for me, there was a point where I still had acne. I still had some hormone issues and had unpleasant periods. And I thought all of those things were kind of normal, but I was really sick of them. And that's what led me down this path. So there's a point where you can kind of get away with this, where you may have had a strong constitution, where things may not show up in a certain way for you until they do. I'm not really willing to take that chance because there's a certain point where it all adds up and it's not worth it.
I think some people call it toxic overload. It's like there's a tipping point. And by the way, you are an adult, you're strong and developed to a certain point, but these children are still more vulnerable, aren't they? They're still developing and growing, and they may be more assaulted by these factors that didn't affect us as much.
And they're exposed to so much more than we were as kids. I'm in my 40s, and there wasn't high fructose corn syrup even in the sodas when I was little. There wasn't the widespread use of hydrogenated oils. So it's a completely different food and chemical landscape than it was for those of us that are adults.
So in the day-to-day, what does this dietary change look like? How do we transition this kid from picky to embracing real food?
It depends on what your method is. It depends on what your goals are and what's worth it for you. So I am not a hardliner when it comes to a particular diet. I think that there should be some play within there and some customization, but you really have to see what is worth it to you. You have to go to the point where you can see the result that you want to get and find out what that feels like, and then see how you can maintain that. So for me, I did the GAPS diet and I found a mental clarity and focus that I had never known before. So when I transitioned off the GAPS diet, I looked to what I could incorporate that would maintain that same benefit. And something like that is the guide for me. And what I want with my clients is to make sure that they can maintain the good health that they've had, but maybe have some freedom in what type of foods they're incorporating sometimes.
Yeah, you said something that I want to latch onto right now. It's the idea of what we can sustain. Sustainability is a word that we use a lot in our foodie circles, right? But what is a lifestyle? What are some changes that we can keep up? Otherwise, you don't want to try something for a few days and then just pitch it all out the window.
Right. And with these dietary changes, it's a lifestyle change. And so I tell people, be prepared for this to be your full-time job for the next couple of months, because you have to make new habits. The first time you start making bone broth, it's going to be really awkward. I know I didn't know which bones to use. There was a big learning curve there. Now it's just second nature. Throw some things in the pot, get it going, forget about it. It's just a shift that happens. So realize that up front and give yourself that time to make these step-by-step changes and know that it will become second nature.
Besides the learning curve, what are some other issues that crop up as we go on this journey?
The most common thing that people experience is anxiety and criticism from the people in their family and close friends. When you start changing your diet, other people take it very personally, even when you don't mean it that way. They start questioning their own choices. They feel like you're critical of them. And so that can kind of come back to you. And it can really hurt somebody's feelings if you're not eating grandma's Christmas cookies that you've always eaten. And what's wrong with them is, people will take that as what's wrong with me? Why don't you like the traditions that we've established? So that's something to be sensitive to, but also to understand that it's not really about you. And this comes back to that mindset piece as well, that so much of how we feel about diet is about our own personal issues and our own self-involvement. So recognize that you're making the best choices for you and other people are doing what works for them. And there shouldn't be that criticism on either side.
You have to be ready to stand strong, right?
You have to be willing to be different. And that's not something that a lot of us are comfortable with at first. But when you feel well, when you see the results in your own life, it makes it so much easier to sustain, because when you're feeling better, why would you want to give that up just because someone else doesn't like it?
Exactly. And I hadn't thought about that piece before that you said a moment ago, that people take it personally. They take it as if your dietary choices are an affront to them. And I've noticed that myself, and I don't like it. And I'm not trying to say that, but that's how people take it, don't they?
That's been my experience. And the thing that's turned that around for me the most is just the confidence that I have in my own eating choices, and not expecting that anyone's going to do anything special for me, but also letting people know I'm going to be bringing my own food, or I'm going to be choosing something different at this restaurant, or suggesting a different restaurant, because that's what works for me. And I need to be confident that I'm making the best choices, but that doesn't mean that their choices are wrong. It's just, when we are taking care of ourselves, we're giving people permission to take care of themselves in the way that's right for them too.
Yeah. And I like what you said about the restaurant, because I went out to eat with some friends recently and we were trying to decide where to go. And I was proactive. I was like, here's a couple spots that I knew had farm to table or locally sourced ingredients. So I was like, okay. And we went with it and nobody was complaining. It was actually delicious, but you have to be proactive. So let's say, going back to Leo from the beginning, instead of, saying, no, you can't go to that birthday party or don't dare touch that cake, you bring an option that is a better choice for him and his friends. You're not just exclusively serving Leo. So there's some ways in which we can make this more palatable, if you will, to those around us.
Exactly. And Weston Price food is delicious. It's the kind of food that most people consider a treat because they don't make it for themselves and they rarely have it. So when you start incorporating these type of meals into your regular diet, other people start seeing you as a foodie and you can share that with them through cooking or through suggesting restaurants that people really love. And then they're more likely to go along with the things that you're suggesting because they feel like, oh, they always want us to have the best food. That's really a great experience. And that's how I kind of position it. It's like, yeah, I have my standards, but I also want things to be really delicious and enjoyable for everybody. So how can I bring them into that part of the experience?
Oh my gosh, I agree so much. Now, I want to go back to little Leo, and I love that he was a success story. But Jennifer, I bet there have been children who have simply dug their heels in and resisted their parents' guidance or not heeded their advice if they were older and just gone out and eaten whatever. What do we do in cases like that?
You just do your best. Bring in what you can. It doesn't have to be perfect all the time for it to be worth it. Maybe it's not the ideal diet that you're going for, and, every single bite they put in their mouth is what you would like. But what can you get in? Are there things? I'm not opposed to sneaking things in. Are there negotiations that you can make with them around, certain meals or certain activities? There's some kids where they just need to know that they're going to go out for ice cream at some point on the calendar, and they'll agree to doing what we prefer day to day at home. So you've got to work with your situation and really listen to your own intuition and not get bogged down by the frustration, but think about the big picture. Think about what really works for your life and make the best choices you can and accept that.
Excellent. And that's the best we can do most of the time on any level, right? We're all just doing the best that we can. So, Jennifer, I want to ask you now as we prepare to close, what motivated you in the first place to write the book From Mac and Cheese to Veggies, please?
I wrote this book because I see so many parents that are on the fence about changing their kids' diet in any way when they know that they need to. And I wanted to give them inspiration to get off that fence and to make whatever change that they can to get started on this new way of life and to breaking picky eating.
If the listener could do one thing to help their picky child, what would you recommend that they do?
I would say just choose one food that you feel would make the biggest difference in your kid's life and your kid's health, and find a way to work that in.
Perfect. That is doable. I'm big on one thing, and you've given us one thing that we can do and change one food, and that's a great step in the right direction. Jennifer, thank you for this time together. It's been awesome. And we will put a link to your book and to other resources in the show notes.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
My guest today was Jennifer Scribner. To connect with Jennifer, go to her website and blog at bodywisdomnutrition.com. For the show notes and highlights from today's episode, with links to resources we mentioned, just go to our website, westonaprice.org, and look for the show notes for episode 131. If you are enjoying this podcast, go ahead and subscribe through Apple Podcasts so you don't miss a thing. You can also rate and review us on iTunes. Every review lets folks know that this show is worth listening to. You can also help us spread the word about Wise Traditions by sharing episodes on social media or by email with your friends and family. Speaking of which, on social media, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Weston A. Price. For updates on ancestral health topics, look for us also on Facebook at the Weston A. Price Foundation. Next week, everybody, I have a wonderful conversation with my friend Becca Griffith about foraging and kind of wilding. What is it like to find food that you can eat and put on your dinner table from your backyard, from a neighbor's apple tree? I mean, it's amazing stuff. So please stay tuned for next week's podcast episode. Hey, and thanks to my friends at Podcast Village, to Rob Ford, Charlie Burney, and the team, and also the interns who help us pull off the show week after week, Cynthia Castro Cohen Enriquez, Joy de los Santos, Amy Marvin, Deirdre Beard, Diva Rizvi, Melanie Ahern, Mary Hine, and Olga de Villiers. Last but not least, please give me your feedback. Let me know what you thought of this episode or give me ideas for future shows. I'm on Twitter at Holistic Hilda, on Instagram at Holistic_Hilda, or just visit my website, holistichilda.com. I want to support you on your wellness or podcasting journey. And thanks, everybody.
Did you know that there are Weston A. Price Foundation chapters all over the U.S. and around the world? Chapter leaders help you find good food in your area, and some have meetings you can attend. Go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on Find a Local Chapter to see if there is one near you. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.